Ken, that was a wonderful and a heartwarming introduction. The reception I received from my many friends, members of this organization yesterday and again tonight is a source of very deep personal gratification to me. I always have been troubled by receiving this type of warm cordiality and support. Every speaker, I suppose, any person who talks very much acquires a certain number of glib phrases to take care of his introduction before he gives a talk. I must say that I never have evolved a very good formula for doing that, and if I had, it wouldn't be a formula that would be commensurate with the type of reception I've received here. As Ken said, a couple of weeks ago I was in North Dakota and met there with many people with whom I have been corresponding and working in this movement for many, many years, several of them going back almost to the very beginning in 1940. I was greatly impressed with the new group which has formed there, which basically is a continuation of the best elements of the old group and of our blind people in the state of North Dakota. But among other things, I did find there also a remark which might in the future serve as a sort of formula for receiving applause if that ever happens to me again. The people in North Dakota are mostly farmers, you know, and they talk about their farms and their animals and use figures that are based on their experiences. At the North Dakota Convention, one of the speakers said that he knew just how to treat this situation. He knew a farmer who had been a big farmer in his day, and he had a lot of cows, and he milked them with milking machines and several hired hands and so on. Eventually, however, he retired, and he sold off his cattle. He decided, however, that he had one cow who was giving especially good milk, and he was more or less attached to her anyway, and he thought he'd keep her and use her as his family cow. Of course, he didn't have any warm barns to keep her in anymore or anything. He just kept her in the backyard. And one cold, wintry morning, he got up and went out there to milk her, and she was standing in the yard all hunched up and with her back against the breeze. And he curried her down a little, and with his hands he brushed off her udder and moved it around a little to make it a little more flexible, and grabbed his stool and sat down. And she turned to him and said, "Thanks for the warm hand." As Ken said, I've been asked to talk about the welfare of the blind's perils and prospects. Welfare, says the Oxford Universal Dictionary, is the state or condition of doing or being well. That's a short definition. It may not cover everything. It does, however, go to the heart of the matter. It identifies the two irreducible objectives of welfare for any individual, those of doing well and being well. The first points to a social and economic condition. To say of a man that he is doing well is to say that he prospers, that he is accomplishing things socially and economically. The second, being well, describes a physical and mental condition, that of bodily health and emotional equilibrium. Personal welfare rests on both of these conditions. So, for that matter, does public welfare. In its accent on relief and basic security, public welfare attends to the well-being of its clients. In its accent on rehabilitation, on self-support and self-care, it looks towards what we may call their well-doing. Both are vital to any adequate and effective system of welfare. How well, then, are blind Americans doing today, and what is the state of their well-being? I shall not draw up a balance sheet of the perils and prospects confronting the blind in welfare problems. I propose to skip the customary practice of pointing with pride to the great advances and achievements which the blind have won since the Poor Laws of Elizabeth or since the Poor Houses of Victoria. Without overlooking these or without forgetting them, I shall emphasize our remaining weaknesses and recurring failures in welfare. I shall focus only upon the perilous prospects rather than the perils and all of the prospects. I shall focus on 10, specifically, interrelated threats to the welfare of the blind, which, if they're taken together, place in jeopardy nearly all that has been won over the past generation of social legislation and reform. These threats to our welfare come from a variety of sources and strike at different points of the system. Some are new, some are ancient, all are immediate. All present a clear and present danger to the preservation of the modern philosophy and practice of welfare. More than that, all but two of these threats are part and parcel of a single movement, lately risen from the gutters of politics and journalism, which has spread its poison over the land from Newburgh to San Diego. You all know the main features of this movement. It speaks of reform, but acts in revenge. It begins with a cleanup and ends in a crackdown. Its voice is the voice of law and equity, but its hands are the hands of Herod. Let us have no illusions about the meaning of this organized assault upon the welfare system of the nation. It is not meant merely to close up a gap or a loophole here and there in the law. It is not meant to uncover the rare conniving client, the one recipient in 1,000 who owns a fur coat or keeps a lover. It is not meant to elevate the morals and improve the character of the millions of Americans, families and individuals, who are, through no fault of their own, needy or incapacitated. It is not meant to clean house, but to bring the house of welfare down. It is not meant to rectify injustice, but rather to wreck that concept of social justice which has found expression in the Social Security program of this nation. As we who are blind observe this calculated campaign of fear and smear, we may well ask the question put to Patrick Henry in his hour of crisis. Sir, what means all this martial array? And we may well answer as he did. It is meant for us. It can be meant for none other. The attack upon public welfare is an attack upon the blind, not vaguely and remotely, but immediately and frontally. When the principle of public assistance is compromised in one of its programs, it is compromised in all. When the protections of law and right are stripped from one group of recipients, they are on the way to being stripped from all. When the dignity and decency of one class of welfare clients is ridiculed, all of them are in jeopardy. Let us look then at these threats to the general welfare one by one. One, the most persistent and pervasive threat to our welfare is also the most ancient. It is simply the undying spirit of the poor law. That bleak and baleful shade finds expression today both in our written laws and our unwritten attitudes. It underlies all the righteous requirements of deserving character, of relatives' responsibility, of length of residence, and of the mean-spirited means test, which are still to be found infesting the public assistance statutes of the states and of the nation. Yet more insidiously, the spirit of the poor law is manifested in the ancient and demeaning stereotype of the welfare recipient, and most conspicuously perhaps of the blind welfare recipient, as somehow deficient in character, inferior in ability, and abnormal in personality. It may seem that we have come a long way in the 125 years since the case of New York versus Milne, in which the United States Supreme Court could speak in one breath of the moral pestilence of the pauper, the vagabond, and the criminal. But as late as 1920, it was possible for a United States senator to gain a public hearing with the argument that federal measures of welfare and rehabilitation would place a premium upon the vagrant, the criminal, and the worthless. After a man has reached the period when he has hardened down into what he is in this world, thundered the senator, do you think you can make over the broken instrument, the failure of life? Let such failures go to the poorhouse. Now, lest anyone think that this Scrooge-like spirit is the extinct relic of a bygone era, that the medieval stereotype of the worthless, needy, has long since been laid to rest. I need only point again to the anti-welfare revival of the past year, in which that ghost from the past has been dramatically disinterred from its grave and made to walk abroad in the land again. Hear the angry outcry of a national mass circulation magazine in a recent diatribe, no worse than many others, entitled "The Scandal of Welfare Chiseling," and it says this: an almost visible wave of resentment has begun to roll across the land against the rackets and abuses that plague the vast, ever-growing American welfare program. The House of Welfare is in disorder. In some places, it is downright disorderly. The original conception of the great welfare programs, continues this article, has been warped and twisted out of all reason. Instead of giving temporary aid to those in need through no fault of their own, welfare rolls now harbor hundreds of thousands of the shiftless, cheats, and criminals. When the rules are complex, the evaders, the frauds, and the rationalizers take over. Close quote. There, my friends, is the first, and many would think the greatest momentary threat to our Social Security. Two, a second and more specific form of the anti-welfare movement is the intrusion into the modern humanitarian law of welfare of the ancient and punitive law of crimes. Congress itself has done much to assist this infiltration. In the social insurances, Congress has decreed that benefits may be denied to a person who commits any of 16 crimes. In public assistance, Congress has fortified the influence of the law of crimes by adding the statutory requirement that law enforcement officers must be notified in all ADC cases where either of the parents is absent from the home. Not to be outdone by Congress, the federal administrators have further opened the door to the spirit of crime and punishment in a regulation recently issued binding upon all the states, prescribing the general character of the criminal law which must apply to welfare and the methods of its enforcement. Within our states, the penetration of the criminal law into public assistance is seen in the increasing proliferation of local rules and practices bringing to bear the methods of the lie detector to determine truth, of the blood test to establish parentage, of the night raid upon the homes of recipients to flush suspected partners, of the beating of park bushes to deter promiscuity, in sum, of the whole repressive weight of criminal investigation and police authority. The challenge to social security involved in this insidious encroachment of the law of crimes is critical and immediate. The human problems with which the programs of welfare are necessarily concerned, problems of economic distress, of social dislocation, of personal confusion, cannot be solved by criminal sanctions and threat of punishment. They can be adequately understood and constructively approached only by measures addressed to their human conditions and inhumane consequences. It is this humanitarian approach that lies at the heart of the modern law of welfare, as embodied in the public assistance program, and goes to the root of its persistent conflict with the much more ancient law of crimes. For the assumptions and objectives of the law of crimes are diametrically opposed. Its preliminary assumption is that persons who are in need are there either through choice or through weakness of character. Its ultimate objective is to wipe out the problem by suppression and punishment. Problems of poverty and immorality, of social crisis and economic depression are all perceived by the law of crimes in the same narrow focus of personal responsibility to be solved by arrest and investigation, by penal sanctions and retributions. 3. Out of this invasion of welfare by the spirit of crime and punishment comes another vital challenge to our whole system of personal and social security, a threat to the rights of the individual. To call the police is to invoke not the general welfare powers of the Constitution, but its police powers. The police powers are those that deal with maintaining order, preventing vice and crime, securing safety, and protecting health and morals. When problems of poverty and need are handled under the police powers of the Constitution, they come to be equated with disease, immorality, and disorder. The constitutional powers of the police have, in fact, been generally relied upon to protect one part of the community against another. In blunt terms, to protect the comfortable against the needy. The classic illustration of this is seen in the notorious case to which I have already referred, that of New York versus Milne, decided by the United States Supreme Court in 1837. It is as competent and necessary for a state, said the justices in that case, to provide precautionary measures against the moral pestilence of paupers, vagabonds and possibly convicts, as it is to guard against physical pestilence. Accordingly, the court upheld as a warranted exercise of the police power a New York statute designed to exclude the poor and the unwanted brought to New York from other states or from foreign countries. Not a few of these ideas survive to plague us today. If they do not have the preeminence and the dominance that they did a century ago, Recent words and actions, both official and unofficial, make clear that they are still alive and kicking. We see it all again in county resort ordinances conceived in prejudice and applied in discrimination against ADC families. We see it in night raids, in polygraph tests, and in unwarrantable searches and seizures. We see it all again in conditions of probation imposed by the judges that forbid mothers to secure public aid for their children, whatever their need or eligibility, that command them to support their children on threat of imprisonment, whatever their ability to do so, whatever the need of the children for their care at home, and whatever the scarcity of jobs for the unskilled and the economically marginal. We see it all again in the unmistakable denial by these actions of the constitutional guarantees of equal protection of the laws, of due process of law, of the right of the people to be secure in their persons, papers, houses, and effects, of the right of privacy, and the right to counsel. We see it all again in our lives as blind people, in the invasion of our rights to organize, in the invasion of our rights to privacy, in the invasion even of our rights to communicate with Congress. For we have a case now developing in one state in which, for this very grievous offense, writing to congressmen, a blind person has been denied the right to operate a vending stand. Justice Robert Jackson, in Edwards versus California, the 1941 counterpart of the Milne case, felt the impulse and found the words to capture the constitutional hopes of the underprivileged. Does indigence, he asked, constitute a basis for restricting the freedom of a citizen as crime or contagion warrants its restriction? We should say now, he continued, and in no uncertain terms, that a man's mere property status, without more, cannot be used by a state to test, qualify, or limit his rights as a citizen of the United States. Indigence in itself is neither a source of rights nor a basis for denying them. The mere state of being without funds is a neutral fact, constitutionally an irrelevance. What is most striking about this statement is not its eloquence, nor even its democratic recognition of the dignity and worth of the human person. What is most striking about it is that it was a minority opinion. It could not command the allegiance of the majority of the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. The task that lies ahead of us, perhaps the greatest of all the challenges to the welfare of the blind and of all Americans, is to elevate this doctrine from a minority plea to a majority command. To transform it from a promise into a reality. Number 4, the threats to our welfare system, which I have thus far enumerated, may seem to you somewhat distant and remote. They are not in reality. But still more obviously immediate is the next threat which commands our attention. It is that contained in the federal support given community relief projects of dealing with work, now made a part of the Public Assistance Amendments of 1962. What these projects do in the end, after all the hedges and qualifications have been uttered, is to put the clients of welfare or their relatives on labor gangs, imposing the ancient and infamous work test as a condition of their receiving aid. Human labor, wherever it is voluntary, has a certain dignity and inherent value. But labor, where it is involuntary, is no more than servitude. It has always been regarded as a proper punishment for crime to be sentenced to involuntary labor. We all recognize the punitive character of the statute of laborers of the 14th century, of the bondage of indentured labor in 18th century America, of the infamous county work farms and workhouses of the 19th century. Now, in the 20th century, we have devised our modern facsimile, our streamlined version, the Work Relief Project. They are all the same in principle, all one in their intention and their effects upon the community and their effects upon the victims. Their intention is today what it has always been, to render the acceptance of aid a humiliation, to wring it around with harassments and intimidations, to destroy utterly whatever thin veneer of decency or dignity or normality may have come to be attached to the concept of public welfare over the past generations. Do I put the case too strongly? Only recall the ignoble experiment put into effect just a year ago by the city of Newburgh. Its main feature was this notion of work gang relief. But it did not stop at that. All able-bodied clients of the Department of Welfare were to be subjected to a monthly muster, a lineup borrowed from the neighboring Department of Police. Applicants for aid were to be fingerprinted, they were to be quizzed, in effect they were given the third degree. And then, if they passed muster, they were dispatched into the city's dumps and gutters to labor for their alms. It does not appear that they were chained, but if they had been, they could not have been more clearly marked and branded as beneficiaries of this city's unchristian charity. What possible excuse can there be for so punitive and degrading a device in our modern program of public assistance? We are told that the Work Relief Project is not just one of work, but also one of training. Where have we heard this line of talk before? Does not this non-competitive program of Make Work, with its spurious claims of employment and training, have a drearily familiar ring to any blind person? It does indeed. It provides an almost perfect parallel to the sheltered workshop for the blind. Indeed, it might be dubbed a sheltered workshop program for ADCers, and eventually, if it finds acceptance in its present form, for the blind as well. For are not the blind, by our own insistent argument, able-bodied too? It is a short step from one program to the other. Neither one provides meaningful training nor adequate employment, but in both cases, only an inferior substitute and unreasonable facsimile, at once inconsistent with the conditions of modern society and with the principles of modern welfare. Number 5, the threats to the present-day welfare system and to its blind recipients are not all on the side of public assistance. On its other side, that of the social insurances, the danger takes the form of a movement of thought and law which, if not brought to a halt, can only end in undermining the original character of the program and wiping out its most distinctive progressive features. The attack on social insurance specifically, on the OASDI program, is a triple-barreled one. First, it would strip the program of its insurance characteristics by defining the regular payroll contributions of future beneficiaries, not as premium payments to a trust fund, but only as another form of federal tax, and a regressive one at that. Second, it would sweep aside as illegitimate and frivolous the time-honored assumption of Congress and the nation that the benefits of social insurance are received as a matter of earned right. Instead, it would regard them as a gratuity, no different from relief to be conditionally granted or withheld by government at its discretion. Finally, this same movement has imported into the law of social insurance an ever-increasing battery of moral, political, and behavioral tests which were no part of the original law and which, in effect, convert its benefits into a reward for good conduct, as is so often the case in public assistance. It is sad to note that the United States Supreme Court has now lent its sanction to this three-pronged assault upon the original meaning of the social insurances. It did so in the case of Fleming versus Nestor 2 years ago, in which it swept aside the notion, once taken for granted by all, that social insurance benefits have the character of an earned right. The program was held to be one in which the contributions of employed persons were not to be regarded as premium payments into a trust fund to be paid back to the insured upon maturity, but rather as a tax to be used in public relief of the retired and the disabled. Insofar as this new doctrine comes to be accepted and enforced, these programs are no longer insurances at all, but only charities, programs of relief to which individual eligibility is never certain, but is forever contingent and revocable. There has thus been smuggled into the contributory social insurances the moralistic norms and nigglings of worthiness, of deserving and undeserving, of good behavior and deviations from it, which traditionally have characterized and distinguished the poor relief programs of public assistance. The challenge which is here laid down goes to the very roots of the social insurances. If they are to retain their original and fundamental character, if they are to justify the faith of those who fathered them and those who now support them, this challenge must be met and turned back. The concept of benefits as a matter not of charity but of right must be fully reinstated, and with it, the consignment to oblivion of all personal tests of morality and conduct as conditions of eligibility. Number 6, no threat to the welfare of the blind people of our land is more urgent and no peril more prominent than the current frontal attack upon their independent program of public assistance set forth in the administration proposal for a new joint category blanketing the blind, the aged, and the disabled. I need hardly emphasize to you how distinct and specialized are the welfare problems of the blind from those of other aided groups. They are vastly different in point of fact. They are recognized as different in point of current law. They must be preserved in their different and their autonomous status if we are not to lose by silent attrition what we have won through active struggle over the past 20 years. Children are not included in the proposed new category. Why not? Because their needs are different from those of adults. It would be ludicrous to cast their lot with, say, the recipients of old age assistance. It is hardly less ludicrous to cast the lot of the blind together with the aged and the permanently and totally disabled. Indeed, What the blind client in his productive years most needs from welfare is the kind of consideration that will set him apart from those who are past retirement and those whose disabilities are total. What he needs, as they do not, or at least not to the same degree, is first of all the provision of training and of opportunity for normal competitive life and livelihood. Perhaps the most tragic consequence of this new categorizing of the blind with the mentally lame and the chronically halt is that these paramount and distinctive characteristics of many blind persons, that they are able-bodied and able-minded, normal in capacity and self-sufficient in potential, is categorically denied and overridden. Not long ago, some experts in social welfare published a study entitled Public Welfare, Time for a Change. This study made the familiar argument for the abolition of the categories. But at the same time, I believe without quite meaning to do so, the authors graphically exposed in a single phrase one of the main reasons for the necessary distinction between categories. They called attention to the process of selective limitation by which public welfare measures in their inception come to focus around certain groups in the population whose claim to social protection is transparently obvious, most typically to children or to persons with particularly anxiety-provoking disabilities, such as blindness, leprosy, or insanity. Close quote. What a forceful reminder this is of the social and psychological associations which blindness carries in its train, for the time-worn tendency to regard the blind as pariahs or as mental defectives, to be put away somewhere out of sight in sheltered retreats where the anxiety-provoking effects of their presence might be reduced to a minimum. Not long ago, in point of historical fact, the blind shared their classic retreat with lunatics, if not with lepers. In the era of the almshouse and the work farm, there was in essence only a single category of welfare recipients, that of the unfortunate. It may well be said that social progress for the blind began on that day when they were first recognized for purposes of welfare aid as a separate category. Once accepted on their own terms, their problem came to be seen for what it is in fact, one primarily of rehabilitation and retraining, of return to normal life, and of reintegration into competitive society. Number 7, the threat of impending dissolution of the separate program of aid to the blind is not the only peril that has been posed by the public welfare package of the New Frontier. Another is summed up in the single key word which provides the theme for the whole program. That word is services. The accent in welfare, said the President in February, must be on services instead of support. And this point has since been hammered home time and time again by the Secretary of HEW and by the people who work in his establishment. The term services has been made to cover a multitude of virtues, but its fundamental meaning is clear. It means simply the services of individualized casework, such as those of diagnosis, counseling, adjustment, psychiatric aid, and the like. These services have, of course, undisputed value in assisting individuals and families to solve psychological and social adjustment. Where the significant causes underlying dependency and need are of such a character, requiring informed guidance and therapeutic counseling, casework services are important and appropriate. But it should be no less plain that where the root causes of poverty and dependency lie outside of rather than within the person, where they are not psychological in origin but broadly economic and sociological, the services of individual casework, however expert, are far from adequate. When an individual or a family is in need, not through such causes as, say, alcoholism or emotional imbalance, but because they are the victims of prejudice, of lack of opportunity, of unusable skills, of regional unemployment, or other environmental causes, the help they need most is of a wholly different character from that which casework services can provide. Indeed, it is not too much to say that the conventional services of casework, misapplied to such instances of hard physical and economic want, may often be negative and even actively destructive in their effect. What is the value of orientation and adjustment services for the victim of discrimination who cannot find work? Is it to teach him to resign and submit quietly to a role of permanent inferiority and second-class status? What of the young blind person who finds himself the victim of a similar, if less blatant, discrimination? Is he to be adjusted to an acceptance of the sheltered workshop as his predestined fate? Let us have done with reckless talk of services instead of support. Let us, above all, cease the gibberish of supposing, as Secretary Ribicoff for one does, that all the vast and deep dislocations of society and of the economy are now to be remedied by the professional skilled services of social casework. Number 8, if there is a threat to welfare in the beguiling phrase, services instead of support, there is a similar and equal danger in that other phrase of the new program, rehabilitation instead of relief. No one would suppose, I believe, that a mere stress upon rehabilitation rather than relief alone would be a bad thing if that rehabilitation is vocational and not merely therapeutic. But why rehabilitation instead of relief? And why, for that matter, services instead of support? It is hard to avoid the suspicion that the original and primary purpose of public assistance, to relieve the distress of poverty and to support those handicapped or incapacitated, are here in grave danger of neglect, if not of extinction. At best, what these official phrases convey is a de-emphasis of the values of relief and support, which means a de-emphasis of the cash grant. They do so, moreover, at a time when the principle of a money payment, the unrestricted cash grant, is in urgent need of more rather than less encouragement. At a time when the pressures are moving to garnish and whittle away the public assistance check and substitute for it the humiliating system of the voucher, or even worse, only case services. What has become known as the principle of adequacy, that the money grant should be both unrestricted and sufficient in amount to meet the stipulated needs of the recipients, is eternally under fire from the penny wise and the plain foolish. The greatest and most glaring weakness of our welfare system today is still that of its level of payments, a failure which cannot be compensated for by any amount of services, however professional or however delightful they may be. What a vicious circle thus suggests itself, with the client caught helplessly in the vortex. It is not only that the services of casework, inadequate in the first place to meet the underlying problems, tend to call out more services and ever more services without touching the real problem. That's bad enough and sad enough. But the evil is further compounded by the fact that the cash grant may itself come with strings attached, tied in with the acceptance of services which in turn control the amount of the grant and even the manner in which it is spent. In short, the threat of services is not simply that they may supplant the basic requirement of adequate financial aid, but that they may condition and regulate it. Number 9. We have observed that the threat of services is, on one side, the threat of further invasion of the rights of clients, notably the right to do with their money as they will, along with a denial of their capacity to act responsibly in their own best interests. This brings us to our next peril and problem facing the blind today, the challenge of those who would lead our lives for us, who would, if they could, not only do for us, but speak for us and even think for us. In more familiar terms, I am referring to the problem of custodialism. It is thus this custodial bias which has led so many of the agencies, though of course, as we all know, not all, to oppose with might and main the right of the blind to organize independently and to be consulted collectively. It is this vested interest which leads the agencies now and even today to oppose the independent ownership of vending stands by their blind operators, thereby lessening the supervisory control of the licensing agency. It is this caretaker mentality which leads the lighthouse keepers to perpetuate the rotting institution of the sheltered workshop, to oppose organization and collective bargaining by its inmates, to turn away their pleas and to break their strikes. To an extent, one may even sympathize with the colonial custodians of the blind. What they face all across the land is nothing less than a revolution of rising expectations. The blind people of America are not content with servile status. Theirs is a full-fledged independence movement. Their demand is for total equality, equality at the bargaining table, equality in the consultation room, equality in the marketplace. When the satraps of the agencies are prepared to meet those democratic terms, when they are ready to work with the blind and not on them, the challenge of custodialism will be at an end. Number 10, the last of the threats to the welfare of the blind is by no means the least. In many ways, it is the gravest of all. It is the self-challenge of our own division and our own dissension. The internal peril of palsy and paralysis. Movements, too, have their diseases, and the worst of these, the one most often fatal, is the virus of creeping anarchy, the blight of disunity and discord, which gnaws at the vitals of a stricken movement until its will is sapped, its strength drained away, its moral fiber shattered. The movement of the organized blind, we all know to our sorrow, has been so afflicted. If our movement is to rise again, there must be among us a massive recovery of the will to live. A revival of the sense of purpose and mission, indeed of manifest destiny, which once infused this federation and fired its forward progress. If we fail in that, more than a movement has died. The Federation has been, above all things, a repository of faith, the faith of tens of thousands without sight and otherwise without a voice. It has become a symbol, a living proof of the collective rationality and responsibility of blind men and women, of their capacity to think and move and speak for themselves, to be self-activated, self-disciplined, and self-governing. In a word, to be normal. Our failure is the death of that idea. Our success is the vindication of that faith. It is not enough to know that the Federation will endure. What is essential is that it shall prevail, that the claim of the blind to normality, their will to equality, their drive for security, and their collective stride toward freedom shall not perish from the land.